Anxiety is good. You have been told that your anxiety is bad. You have even been told, do not be anxious. What happens when someone tells you, do not do something or do not think a certain way? Right now, if I told you, do not think of an elephant, what comes to your mind? An elephant. Now you are thinking about an elephant. So when someone says, do not be anxious, unconsciously, you are now more anxious. And like I said in the beginning, anxiety is actually good. And I'm going to go into why that is in more depth. But also stress. People tell you, don't be stressed. Get stress out of your life. Avoid stress. Eliminate stress. Is that even possible? It is not. You cannot get rid of stress. You should not get rid of stress. Stress is a part of our life. Stress is growth and anxiety is good. Keep listening. I promise I will make sense. My life, if you know anything about my life, has been very stressful. It started in 2005 when I had one of my adopted sons died in a drowning accident. And that is grief and trauma. And we were going through all of that. But the stress was actually over the course of many years. When in 2006, my son was diagnosed with a very, the catastrophic epilepsy started. And I can tell you, I've always known that stress is good. And I do really well in an emergency situation. I'm a psychiatric nurse practitioner. I started off as an emergency room nurse. I do well in emergencies. I remember the very first time that my son Reggie had a seizure. It was Christmas Eve. We were at a family gathering, and my brother had my son, who was at the time 6 years old, and he was holding him by the hands and spinning around, that fun little human roller coaster thing. And all of a sudden you hear a scream. And I knew something bad was happening. And in that moment, my anxiety allowed me to be hyper-focused. I come to the side of my son, who is having his first grand mal seizure. And although I know that inside, I know that this is very bad, I was able to stay hyper-focused, have someone call 911, put him on his side, make sure that he's breathing. If I had no anxiety, I wouldn't respond. If I had panic level anxiety, I might be paralyzed or not be able to think. Anxiety is natural. It is our natural response to stress. And in those times, I do really well. And maybe you do too. My life continued to have a series of stress after stress after stress. And I could not eliminate that stress. I could not avoid that stress. My son was continuing to have seizure after seizure, doctor's appointment after doctor's appointment. And so I had to use my anxiety. Yes, I was afraid for my child. I was afraid for the future. I was afraid that something horrible would happen to him, that he would die, that he would get hurt. And some of those things happened. I remember his worst seizure. We were at the doctor's office getting a very hopeful treatment. We were getting IVIG, immunoglobulin. It was supposed to kind of foster his immune system to be able to kind of turn off these genes that were attacking his brain. And in the middle of the treatment, he started to seize. And that hope turned to anxiety. But I was able to hyper-focus and care for him. But it was literally the worst seizure of his life. And as he was seizing, he broke his femur, the strongest bone in his body. And as I think back to that day, the fear and anxiety was very intense. But I needed that. I couldn't say, I'm not going to be anxious. I couldn't eliminate the stress in my life. These were the things that were happening to me. And taking those moments and If you follow my story, you know that it literally was 15 years of one thing after another. Anxiety is our response, our reaction to that stress. Now, I am not saying that anxiety cannot turn to a negative. And I ended up losing both of my children, Reggie in 2016 and Maya in 2021. And as I was grieving and healing from that, I realized I have PTSD, which is a very not good form of anxiety. But we can't avoid anxiety. What I often see happen with people with PTSD is they then, yes, the diagnosis of PTSD, what happened to my brain from that chronic anxiety and stress created a disordered pattern in my brain after the stress was over in the process of grieving their loss. But what I often see people do is then they avoid. They say anxiety is bad. I'm going to avoid all things that trigger this anxiety in me. And I challenge you, that anxiety that you have now or had in the past was what you needed to respond to your stress. And for me, now that I'm safe and that the stress is over, learning and acknowledging that anxiety was good and that I don't have to continue in that heightened anxiety in my life now. I can't avoid future stress, and I definitely couldn't avoid that past stress. But how do we grow from that? I've done a lot of personal work around this, and I know that I am a stronger person from what I successfully went through. And when I say successfully went through, as I'm still standing. And yes, I lost my children. It is literally the hardest thing. But this is why I talk so much about what I call the mentally strong method, because we need to organize these things. My grief is not my anxiety. My trauma is not my grief. We often get all of these things enmeshed together, and then our anxiety becomes a disorder. And I have been diagnosed with PTSD, and we kind of joke about, like, I finally allowed myself to be diagnosed with that. But I am working through that, and you can work through that. Anxiety is not bad. Stress cannot be avoided. But what can we do about it? We've got to learn how to think through our problems, organize them so that we can make choices in line with what we want. And that's what we do in the mentally strong method. So when we think through our problems, we take a thought that we're going through right now and we allow ourselves to see the patterns of the past. And this is often what happens with our response to stress and our maybe inability to control our anxiety to make it good. In the description, I have a worksheet called Anxiety as a Strength, and it talks about it being this continuum. I want you to reframe anxiety, right? Anxiety is good. It is your way to respond to your environment. If you get into the severe and panic anxiety and someone is telling you, do not be anxious, or you're telling yourself, do not be anxious, anxiety is bad, you're feeding into that. Remember what I said, when you say do not do something, you're going to bring more of that attention to it, and it's not going to be serving you. Anxiety is to serve you. Anxiety is your protection. When it gets into moderate, you're in a heightened state, like my story. And unfortunately, my story was 15 years of a heightened state. But that was my response to stress. I couldn't sit back and say, oh, well, my child is seizing nonstop and there's nothing I can do about it. Do not be anxious about your child seizing nonstop. That's ridiculous to try to say. And it's ridiculous to say, do not be anxious. I had a reason to be anxious, and you may have a reason to be anxious. It is your protection. But when you allow it to get into severe and panic, you're not able to use utilize it as a strength. And you also might need to think about, are you feeding into negative? Are you catastrophizing? I have a video on distorted thinking. Are you actually creating more stress than's actually there, right? So learning how to think through your problems, organize them, make choices in line with what you want, and, learn to differentiate that. Anxiety is good when it is your protection to your stress. Stress is growth. We can't avoid stress. And how we respond to that, how we learn to utilize our anxiety for good, allows us to grow through stress. After this 15 years of fighting for my children, and now going through a process of grieving and healing from PTSD type response after the fact, I know that I could handle anything, right? That stress made me a stronger person. So take ownership of your anxiety. Know that it's your protection. Make sure that you're not feeding in or catastrophizing your stress. Go and watch the distorted thinking video and begin to have this balance of how to utilize your anxiety.